Hoppy History, a podcast about beer, history, and people. Hop on board with us as we crack a few beers and talk about all the great history.
Welcome to Hoppy History, a podcast about beer and history. If you like our content, please subscribe to us. Of course, don't hesitate to like our YouTube page. And by all means, stick around for a beer as we talk about history of beer and the history of the world, really. I'm David Schellenberg. Joining us is Paul Meek from Kichesippi. First for a couple of episodes. Hello, Paul.
Hello, sir. How are you?
I'm doing okay. You know, this is that time of year when the trees are greener than they've been in a long time. And, a perfect time to kick back and have a beer and talk about the world.
It is very good beer drinking weather right now.
It is. And you, how are you?
Doing great. Yeah, doing great. It's it's almost summertime and it's a beautiful sunny day outside, and we're talking about some wonderful things today. We're talking history, we're talking beer, and it's going to be a great day.
Yeah, and today we're talking about Prohibition. Now, Prohibition was, for many of us, when we look at our history, a dark time in history. Mm-hmm. That's kind of facetious, but at least for me, a dark time. And what? People couldn't do this? So Paul, tell us a little bit about what was Prohibition?
Yeah, I think like a lot of things, this had the best intentions, right? It was people didn't do it to be cruel. People didn't do it to pick a fight. People did it because they thought it was the right thing for society at the time.
Right.
So what is prohibition? Prohibition is at its basics the illegal consumption of alcohol. So during wartime, the late 1914, 1916, in around that area, it was illegal to consume alcohol in the province of Ontario.
And illegal as in completely and totally illegal. Like we'd think about, okay, maybe you couldn't buy it in this store or that store, but you could still have it at home. But no, it was illegal.
Yeah, exactly. It was nobody was coming around to your front door, checking to see if you had a beer in your fridge.
Right.
But yeah, there was it was a crazy time because there was many dates and many comings and goings and ins and outs in terms of the U.S. was a clean slate, illegal all through the U.S.
Yeah.
Most of Canada, except for Quebec, actually was illegal as well. But there was different start and stop points in there, and there's a lot of gray area in that time. So, but yeah, at its basics, Prohibition, you cannot consume alcohol within these government boundaries.
And what on earth happened at that point in history that made people step up and say, we cannot have alcohol of any kind anywhere in the province of Ontario and Canada and the United States?
Yeah, so, interestingly, it's the war and COVID are not the same thing, but they did have the similarities in terms of our lives were put on hold. During COVID the last 3 years, people, their lives were on hold. You took pause, you took reflection on what was going on. And back, during the First World War, a lot of people's normal life was on hold. Many men were away fighting in the trenches. Many women were all of a sudden taken out of their homes and put to work in terms of whether it's ammunition plants or just general ways to support the family. And all of a sudden, life changed and things had a major pause in terms of the day-to-day. And there was a major movement in terms of women saying, we don't like this. This is, it's not whether there's domestic violence or things like that are affecting a happy household. We didn't think that the consumption of alcohol was good for our family life.
Right.
We want it gone.
Yeah.
So whether it's a massive women movement in terms of their empowerment and their voice in society, as well as the Methodist Church, were the two main drivers for Prohibition in Ontario.
And so what were these guys doing at that point that would make it was so bad that alcohol had to be eliminated?
Yeah. So this is, of course, it's all anecdotal. But I'm not going to question anybody's reasons to want their life to be better. But the stories are based around the prototypical go to work all day and then come home and get drunk and be a horrible person because you're too drunk to do the right thing, whether it's affecting your wife or your children or your fellow neighbor physically. There was definitely that whole, I'm not happy with my life. I'm going to drink to self-medicate and to drown my sorrows, and then as a result doing bad things. Yeah.
I've read some books and seen some stuff on it as well, and it's fascinating on how cheap alcohol got, because I suppose when you take away all the taxes and everything around alcohol and just bring it down to crappy booze, it can be made fairly cheaply. And it sounds like that was a lot of what this was happening, was there hit a point in the world of agriculture where we had progressed enough that we could make booze I don't think it was very tasty, but it got you loaded.
Exactly, and it wasn't to sit around and say, oh, I'm going to savor this lovely glass of brandy or beer or wine and swirl the glass and talk about the legs and the lovely aromas of fruit and berry. Yeah. It wasn't about that. It was how can I literally drown my sorrows away because I'm not happy with my life and I don't know how to actually, because again, back then nobody was talking about mental health issues. Nobody was talking about being emotionally available. It was I'm not happy with my life. I'm going to literally drown my sorrows and go into another world where I don't have to face reality. And so, it wasn't about taste and quality. It was about getting the job done. How can I get as drunk as possible, as quickly as possible, to not have to face my own demons?
And there are some amazing pictures of what the saloons looked like at this point. And I remember one drawing that I saw had a trough down the middle of the saloon, and it was for urinating.
Yeah.
Like the stories, some of the ones that I had read was, you would have a strip of saloons along a street. And the bars were so worried this was the days of outhouses, if you went out to the outhouse, the neighboring bar would pull you in with some sort of a lure for an even cheaper drink than what you're already getting. So the guys did not leave their drinking establishment.
Amazing,
They put a trough down the middle, and that way you never had to go anywhere.
There's so many crazy stories about that time. There was one of the, and again, this is one of these myths. It sounds pretty true, for sure. So there's
it's just plausible enough that it might be true.
Absolutely. One of the early iterations of the liquor inspector was known as the conner. So the conner would come into a bar, and he would order 2 beers. And what he would do is he would pour the first beer literally on his bar stool and then sit in it. And you're thinking, why is he going to sit in this wet? Like, why is he going to get his bum all wet?
Yeah.
But while he was drinking his other beer, what he would do is when he got up from his bar stool, if it was sticky, he knew that there was a lot of alcohol, in there. But if it was not sticky, then they knew that the bartender or the owner was watering down the alcohol to prevent paying taxes. And it's but you're thinking like you're literally, these crazy stories about times back then and how they were, as you say, whether it's keeping people in the bar or making sure that the government was getting their taxes or people weren't, avoiding the rules. So it was definitely a crazy time. Coming out of Prohibition, the Roaring 20s, lots of change, right?
Well, and I was thinking about that too. At that particular moment in history, was there was a terrible depression, and we sort of have gone through that a little bit in 2008. You go through some economic hard times. We're going through some economic hard times right now as well. However, what we are going through at this moment is nothing compared to what happened to the history or the economy in this part of the world at that point in history.
Absolutely, yeah. No, it's impossible to fathom just how bad it was back then. Right?
Yeah.
We're thinking, it's a little tough this month. I'm not sure if I can, buy that nice coat or whatever kind of thing. And I'm not saying it's that frivolous or you've heard the term first world problems.
Right.
So our first world problems, are not as bad as, not even close to what it was, over 100 years ago in terms of literally not having work. The breadwinner of the house would go out and line up in numerous lines to try and get work for the day kind of thing to try and get some pennies to bring home to feed the family.
Yeah, astounding. Now, Prohibition was done differently in different parts of Canada and different parts of the United States, and even between Ontario and Quebec. What were some of the differences?
Yeah, Quebec. So that's one of the big misnomers is that people thought that, like the U.S., that Canada was a clean slate across the country. But Quebec was the only province at the time that didn't actually jump into prohibition. So it was a very, very different time. But
none at all in Quebec.
No, not at all in Quebec. And what was interesting, though, even though Quebec is close to the U.S. and has shares some border, it was basically that Windsor corridor,
right?
The proximity from Windsor to Detroit. It was literally you've heard of the term the path of least resistance.
Right.
Going from the Windsor over to Detroit was so close and so easy that it was that whole why make it any more difficult on myself? I'll just take the shortest route possible. I was reading this fantastic book. They were saying a good center fielder could have probably thrown a ball across the river. It was that close.
Yeah.
Where if you're going to try and go from a place where because that was the crazy thing. There was certain times during the Prohibition in Ontario where you couldn't drink the alcohol. You couldn't bring alcohol into the province. You couldn't drink, but it was okay to manufacture. So it was legal to actually manufacture alcohol and ship it to a jurisdiction where Prohibition did not exist. So. Right, so you can't drink it.
Okay, I had to think about that one for a minute. Okay.
Well, this is where it gets really interesting because there were so many gray areas and there was a lot of moving parts. So there was a time where no, you can't drink it, but then there's other times where we can manufacture things here because we want jobs. Because,
Right.
again, people are trying to put people to work,
Yeah.
and we can still ship it to places around the world where prohibition doesn't exist. And so people were like, well, I'll just pick it up and say I'm going to take it to Cuba or to wherever, and then if it doesn't get there, then it doesn't get there.
Right.
One of the Canadian government made a slaughtering off of this in terms of taxes, because what they did was they put a $9 per gallon tax on intoxicating beverages, which would be alcohol.
$9 a gallon.
$9 a gallon.
In what year?
Late 1919s, early 1920s kind of thing.
That would be in the hundreds of dollars.
Right, but what it was like it was a temporary tax. It was like, we'll put a $9 tax on per gallon, and then if you say it's going to go to Cuba and Cuba doesn't have prohibition, then if you can show us a customs receipt, we'll give you the $9 back. Well, all these rum runners and prohibition runners said, I'll just eat the $9, like it's whatever, and so the government never had to refund those $9. So at one point they were saying they're making like $30 million a year, which is 100 years ago it's a lot. As you say, in current dollars, it's a lot more money. So people were just like, I'll eat the $9, I'll pass it on.
They had that much money sitting around that they could just use it.
Because that's the thing. We talk about. And people were desperate. They don't have jobs. They don't have money.
Right.
So it's one of those. If I can find somebody who's going to buy this booze, under the table, then it's I'll do what I got to do to feed my family, right?
Yeah, for
so
sure.
It wasn't about trying to be an outlaw. It was about trying to just survive, and you do what you needed to do to get done, right? So.
Yeah. And in Ontario, I thought there was also still some provisions for Ontario-made. Was it wines? And beers, there was still something in there that was still allowed in the province.
Yeah, so right now we talk about in the province of Ontario the LCBO,
right,
or in the province of Quebec the SAQ. So we view beer, wine, spirits, coolers, all that kind of as one and the same. But 100 years ago, they were all viewed very differently. So there was a very major distinction between what they called strong liquids or strong alcohol versus lighter. So beers at 4.4% or under, and low alcohol wines and ciders were not viewed as harmful, again, because it takes you more to drink.
Yeah.
But the stronger beers and the stronger spirits were definitely the bigger enemy. So so there was, again, there's these gray area and this moving target. It wasn't just prohibition started and then prohibition ended. There was many iterations and many modifications along the way, and one of them was. One of the politicians was called Ferguson. So it was called Ferguson's Foam, which was, beer up to 4.4% alcohol was okay.
Ferguson was the politician?
Yeah. So he brought in a modification to the laws to say, beer up to 4.4, what we would call a light beer, was okay. That it wasn't as harmful to society as, the stronger alcohol. So that was one of the changes that came a long way before Prohibition was repealed.
So in Ontario, we could have still gone and bought alcohol at the store?
If you were no, so there was during the initial parts of Prohibition, you could buy it if you were basically reselling it, to a jurisdiction. So if you were considered an exporter, But there was a time that you couldn't buy alcohol at all in the early days of Prohibition. Now, again, there's always ways around that, but legally, no, you could not.
Right. Yeah. I suppose we should take a moment to say what we are drinking while we're talking about the history of beer, because we it's time for the beer break.
Nice.
So what are we drinking, Paul?
We are drinking some Hell or High Water.
Yeah.
So we're very got some nice German influences at our brewery. Our original brewmaster was trained in Germany. Our current brewmaster was also trained in Germany. Spent 3.5 years training over in Germany. So we are drinking a beautiful German Helles. So when we talk about history of beer, German. When we think of Pilsner was originally created in Czech Republic, but the Germans have said, hey, look, we're getting a lot of people drinking Czech beers. We need to create our own easy drinking lager, so people aren't drinking Czech Pilsners. We want them to drink German beers.
Right.
Germany created a beer called Helles. So Helles means bright. Heller means brighter. So we think we're funny sometimes. So Hell or High Water,
Yeah.
Is our beautiful German lager. So that's what we're drinking today. It's a nice hot day here in Ottawa.
Yeah, it is.
And having a nice crisp German lager is a beautiful choice.
And you talked about being a Pilsner. So in your mind, what's a Pilsner?
In my mind, so a Pilsner, every beer on the planet comes down to one of two categories.
Right.
A lager or an ale. So a Pilsner, is a lager. So when we talk about the fermentation part of the process, when lagers are fermenting, so lager is two things. Lager is an action, and lager is a yeast.
Right.
So when the beer is lagering, when the beer is aging, the yeast will filtered down to the bottom of the tank, and that's why when you're drinking a lager, it's more clean and crisp. Where the ale yeast spend more time at the top of the tank. So if I was, again, most people just like order a beer, but in terms of trying to delve into,
I order usually the order one that's on sale.
Nice. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Whether maybe it's choice, maybe it's style, maybe it's this is a nice pretty can. But when you're drinking a beer and you taste it, and that the taste lingers on your palate, that is an ale.
Right.
If you're drinking a beer and you get a nice taste and clean finish, that is a lager. And what we would find, again, going back to those days we were talking about the saloon and the troughs and all that stuff, people would come in and they would just point up or they would point down. So pointing up meant I wanted an ale, top fermenting beer, or pointing down meant I wanted a lager, a bottom fermenting beer. So that's how they would literally order, give me 2 ups or 2 downs. So that was a common thing back then in terms of they knew which way the beer was fermented and would choose ale versus lager.
Well, that's good to know.
There you go.
The people at that point knew more about maybe the history or the production methods of beer than sometimes I think we know today.
Absolutely, and I think this is what's interesting. I think the beer industry is at fault for not maybe teaching as much. Wine. People are learning about wines and learning about some unique bourbons and barrels and things like that. But I still think the beer industry can do a better job of teaching the consumer. The people do want to know. About these things, and not just I'll have an ice cold beer in a frosty mug.
Right.
So we've definitely moved away from that in terms of we've learned why those choices are not necessarily the best choice for the enjoyment of a beer.
Yeah.
But the average consumer would not know the difference between an ale or a lager, and what that all is about.
Right, but I think a lot of people sort of know what they like and know what they don't like.
Yeah, but I would agree. But they would know. They know that they've tried. Again. You go into 95% of the bars in North America, the number one selling beer on tap will be a lager. Because people just want, in the end, they want refreshing, delicious.
Yeah, and a Pilsner has a little bit of a bite to it.
Absolutely, yeah. So that bite comes from the malt and the hop. So a Pilsner is not just going to be what we would call a crushable beer. There definitely is some body to it, some characteristic to it. It's not too malty, it's not too hoppy. It does a really fantastic job, but it's not just your Coors Light kind of thing.
No,
it's got a little bit more personality to it for sure.
A good food beer.
Absolutely, yeah. So on that point, when we talk about whether it's a wine needs food or a beer needs food, what people are saying there is so the tannins in wine and the hops in beer both do the same thing. So when we take a hoppier beer. Like our friend Pierre made a beautiful West Coast IPA for us. So when we enjoy that West Coast IPA, there's going to be a lot of hop presence in that beer. So what we can do is we can have a fattier dish. So the more hop in the beer, the more tannin in the wine can work with more fat content in our food. So when you're having a glass of wine or you're having a hoppy beer, you're going to literally feel your mouth satiating, creating saliva, and it's looking for food to break down. So yes, when you've got too light of a beer that doesn't have enough hop characteristic, if you put a big fish and chips or a big, steak with some peppercorn sauce, the beer is going to not be able to stand up to that. But you could have a Pilsner or an IPA which got a bit more hop characteristic, which will stand up to some bigger sauces and bigger, fat content in the dish to help you cleanse your palate and get ready for the next bite.
Excellent.
Yeah.
All right. Back to history.
Let's go back 100 years ago.
Yeah. Now you got me wondering about what kind of beers they would have been drinking. Like, before Prohibition, now I've completely thrown the timeline out the window. But before Prohibition, when you've gone in a saloon and ordered a beer, was it the saloon itself that was like making the beers?
Yeah. So ales are very heavily influenced from England.
Yeah.
Lagers are very heavily influenced from the U.S. as well as from Germany and Austria. So ales are older than lagers because in order to make a lager, we needed refrigeration. So ales have been on the planet longer than lagers have. So the bartender would, the saloon owner would choose, and often it would be, if I was to predict, it's more likely an ale back then than it would be a lager for sure. Yeah.
And I think some of the classic Canadian companies who are still around today, and I think of some whiskey companies, were a part of Prohibition.
Absolutely.
And were a part of making products, and I think they will even admit to their role in history of moving some illegal booze around.
Absolutely, definitely. So I've worked for some different companies before founding my own brewery 13 years ago.
Yeah.
And along the way, I had a great time working for John Sleeman at the Sleeman Brewery in Guelph, Ontario. And he's got history and some notes of selling beer to Al Capone. Like it was Prohibition comes along, and all of a sudden they're doing what they can to try and get by.
Yeah.
And it's one of those you're not going to get slapped on the wrist. For that now to admit to a crime 100 years ago.
Right.
But, that was what they had to do to survive as a business 100 years ago.
Yeah. It's quite fascinating to think of of what they would have done at that point. And as we move through Prohibition, so obviously it ended, and what exactly changed to come to the end of Prohibition?
Yeah. So what we found the initial way the Prohibition came in was obviously through a vote. So the vote in Ontario at the time had a 400,000 person swing, so 400,000 more people voted in favor of it than against it. But there was obviously enough.
It was an actual
referendum
across the country.
Yeah, province. So again, it's all the provinces had their own say in this. So we'll talk specifically to Ontario numbers.
Yeah.
Because again, the massive part of that was again going across the Windsor-Detroit situation. So so the provinces had different timelines and different votes.
Yeah.
But Ontario specifically, the first ever vote was 400,000 more people in favor of it than not.
That's huge.
Yeah, and then the new government come in. Again, this was highly influenced by the Methodist Church, highly influenced by the women's movement in terms of their empowerment. And then the next time it got voted on, the government thought, hey, we can get this outvoted. A slimmer margin, only 33,000 people more than against. And then in the next time around, it got outvoted. So, but yeah, the initial thing was, because I couldn't tell you exactly the demographic at the time, but each time they went back to the vote, it slowly swung the other way.
The other way, yeah. And you got to wonder if that ended sort of the way we saw cannabis in Ontario become legalized as well, where like the laws changed. And then within 6 months, there was cannabis stores everywhere, and it seems like we keep getting yet another one opening up and opening up and opening up. And would Prohibition have ended that same way, where all of us, and here we go?
I think what people realized early on, and again, it takes the government takes time to make change, is that by saying you can't do it doesn't mean they're not going to do it. So by saying, okay, you can't drink alcohol, and all of society is not going to go, oh, okay, sorry about that. It was legal yesterday, but you say I can't do it today. Okay, no problem. It's just people. It was a losing battle. And we found that whether it's government in terms of prohibition, whether it's government getting into the gambling business, the lotteries, casinos, things like that, and now the government's saying, you know what, it all comes down to the same old thing. It all comes down to taxes. So can we, is this what's good for society? And is there enough tax dollars coming in that we can again afford to have certain supports for people that have gambling problems or substance abuse problems and things like that, make sure that those people are supported. But yes, it has a similarity to the cannabis, but not the exact, where it was legal, then illegal, and then legal again. There's obviously, we're going way, way back now, where there was a time that, you could get cocaine and heroin were much more prominent.
Yeah.
Way, way back.
The good old days.
Before our time.
Yeah, oh yes, exactly.
Exactly. But yeah, so there definitely is similarities in terms of, let's make sure we're being responsible.
Right.
But, let's also make sure that, the society can get what they want. Again, it's an interesting comparison in terms of wartime and COVID, but when early COVID happened, in 2020, the Ontario government says we're gonna come out next week with a list of stores that are essential, that we keep these stores open, and the other ones have to close. And so we, as a brewery, we were like, okay, are we going to be deemed essential? And we had predicted rightly that we would be deemed essential, because you would literally have a mutiny on your hands if you said, oh, brewery and liquor store, you have to close.
Right.
So the amount of complaints and visits to the hospital and and it's people just needing to have a drink of something would have been so overwhelming to the government and the system to battle that, when the government and the medical system's already battling COVID. To put that on top of it would have been a massive mistake, and they knew that. Then that's why they didn't go that route. So there was definitely learning that we need to be not saying that we want to go and get drunk, but it was the society is going to want this, and that it was deemed essential in terms of what was best for society at the time. But it does sound crazy to say a liquor store is an essential service. Really? It sounds a little weird, but when you look at the big picture and what when you tried to take it away from people 100 years ago, you've learned that lesson.
Yes, yeah, exactly. I remember during COVID, I got declared essential as well, and I figured I could get a raise out of that, but that didn't
nice.
work.
Were you guys? That's right. That's true. But
Yeah.
you would have gone more remote. Or were you still
No, we were.
in the studio?
Yeah, I worked for a radio station, and some radio stations were doing it remotely.
Okay.
We tried that and decided that it just didn't really work.
Right.
There are certain things that just work together, and everybody's in the same room.
Exactly.
And so it didn't take long before we just, we'll just call ourselves a bubble and
Right.
keep going to work. Now, when Prohibition did come to an end, were there parties and parades in the streets? And And was there any sort of a celebration, or was it just kind of a change of a law one day, and then gradually we worked through the systems?
Yeah, there definitely wasn't any ticker tape parades, but it was
Ticker tape.
Exactly. The Yankees just won the World Series.
Yeah, I know, right?
Yeah, it wasn't like that, but it was, again, things have to change. So it's one of those. Okay, one day I'm out there illegally, selling alcohol across the border and picking on my speedboat or in my plane or in like there was literally, they were talking about these stories of these cable lines literally dragging cases of alcohol across the river bottom. But yeah, so the government said, okay, we're gonna go back to an area of non-prohibition, and at the time they decided let's make sure that again we're doing what's best for Ontario, doing what's best for our consumer, and they set up this entity known as Brewers Retail, where you could buy beer produced by Ontario brewers. So there was like 1927. It's a great idea to say, hey, look, we're going to set up this system because we don't want the government to run the system. We want literally the brewers of Ontario to run the system, where they can set up their own line of stores, and sell Ontario-made beer in Ontario stores for Ontario citizens.
Right.
So back then, that was known as the Brewers Retail System, which we now know as the beer store.
The beer store.
So one of the biggest misnomers of the beer store is that it is not government-owned. And the average consumer would think that the government owns the beer store, where it's actually owned by the Brewers of Ontario. But the problem is, like a lot of things, after 96 years, things become outdated. And the Brewers of Ontario are no longer owned by the people of Ontario. So your Labatt and your Molson and your Sleeman would own well over 90% of the beer store system.
Because it was those three that started?
Not Sleeman, most Labatt. And this is, so you've got Labatt breweries, and then there would be there was Carling, there was O'Keefe, Molson's, and there was some amalgamation on that end.
Yeah.
Sleeman didn't exist, at the time. But yeah, so it was, and there was some smaller breweries, your Formosas, your Algonquins, those kind of things. So there was many smaller brewers that was basically say let's all band together and create a retail system where we can, which makes sense.
A distribution system too.
Absolutely. If I said to you today, hey, we're going to set up a place, we're going to call it the craft beer store, where all the craft brewers of Ontario could jump in and sell your beer. You think that sounds like a fantastic idea.
Well, just getting it around the province.
Right.
I could see how 100 years ago, transportation would have been very, very complicated. So if all the breweries could work together, and we'll all ship beer to different parts of the province, this huge province,
create some efficiencies of scale. Create some, and that it's good for the businesses, good for manufacturing jobs, good for the consumer. That makes a lot of sense. But now, 96 years later, the store hasn't evolved all that much.
No.
And the biggest issue is that the essence of it is meant to be the brewers of Ontario, and now those major breweries are no longer Ontario owned.
No,
so
they are humongous corporations, global corporations.
Absolutely, yeah. Look, Labatt is owned by the Brazilians. Molson Coors, has a American head office, and Sleeman's owned by Sapporo in Japan. So the essence of what was trying to be accomplished 96 years ago was the right idea. But it hasn't evolved with the times, and it's no longer applicable to having your head office in Ontario, whatever that caveat is, whatever that rule is. So I think it'd be great to see some evolution, and you're going to see some evolution on that in terms of, again, the government making sure there's a balance between what's good for manufacturing jobs in the province, what's good for taxation, and what's good for the consumers in general.
Because when you think about in the United States, when they ended prohibition, you can go into most corner stores and buy actually some very good beers. The big ones are all there, but any corner store in the United States and Quebec as well is smart enough to know, I want some variety. So when the Americans came out of prohibition, they somehow or other moved on a little bit quicker than Canada did.
Definitely. I would say it'd be funny, I've grown up in Ontario, and there's things that we consider normal that when you look at the rest of the world are not normal. Like it's like grade 13. I thought grade 13 was everywhere, and all of a sudden it's like, wait a second, nobody else does grade 13. No. Why do we do? Okay, and then we eventually canceled grade 13. Yeah. If you come to Ontario, it's like, okay, go to the liquor store. I can get beer, wine, and spirits, and but beer's only in 6-packs or singles. But I can go to the beer store and I can just get beer. Yeah. But I can go to some grocery stores and get beer and wine, but not spirits, but not other grocery stores. It gets unbelievably confusing. Instead of and this is where the Doug Ford government is definitely trying to get out of their own way. It's typical conservative government in terms of having less government. So let's get out of our own way and put beer in as many spots as possible, which we think is best for what the consumer is looking for. So,
which is literally what the world does.
right.
Like there's, I don't know of anybody else that has it structured the way that Canada does.
No, it was interesting. Like because of the structure that exists, the LCBO at the time, 10, 15 years ago, was the largest purchaser of alcohol on the planet. They've since been passed by Costco in the United States, which is now the largest purchaser. But every producer of alcohol in the world wanted to be in the LCBO because they were the biggest customer on the planet, which is just the amount of power and control from this one little jurisdiction. Again, we're not saying Ontario's little, but worldwide it is.
Right.
It was just so foreign and so different than anything else you'd saw worldwide.
And for those of us who live like in Ottawa, with Gatineau on one side of the river and Ottawa on the other, Quebec laws are so different than Ontario laws, and the price of beer at a store in Quebec and the price of beer in Ontario makes no sense. Right.
So, and this is where, if you look behind the curtain, it all comes down to provincial taxes. So, both whether you're a Quebec brewery or an Ontario brewery, you pay the same what's called excise tax, which is a federal tax. But the provincial taxes that we get charged from Ontario compared to the provincial taxes in Quebec are, like, I pay 10 times the amount of provincial tax on my beer that I produce versus the federal tax, which that provincial tax is not even, close to what it is in Quebec or Alberta or things like that. So we're currently working with our great friends at the Ontario Craft Brewers, which is our lobby group to the provincial government, saying you're doing nothing but hurting, these, again, this is not helping manufacturing jobs. This is doing nothing for the consumer. This is doing nothing for the economy. It's just, but it's at the same time, I can see where the government's coming from, because it's not sexy to say, hey, let's reduce taxes on alcohol.
Right.
That's not going to win you a lot of votes, but in terms of it is what we think is the best thing to do for the overall economy and the overall manufacturing jobs in the province. But yes, right, living across the river, it's tremendously different. Like, I know many people that it's like they've got 4 or 5 friends, and they each go over to Quebec. Once, hey, it's your week to go over to Quebec, and pick up all the beer for our 4 or 5 guys, and then when it's your turn, you go and you pick up the 5 or 6 2-4s or the 5 or 6 octagons, and load up on beer, because it's worth the drive, to save on the taxes, because it's 20 minutes away.
Oh, it's ridiculous. Yeah. And I suppose that gets to this kind of last area of when Prohibition ended, it did affect the economy, as things got back on track, and how big of a difference did that actually make? Yeah,
so you saw that, it affected the economy greatly. We touched a little bit on terms of the government pulling in those taxes that were never refunded. Yeah. That $30 million a year in terms of tax that should have been coming down to zero. But the way it affected the economy greatly was that all of a sudden things were being sold above the table and not below the table anymore. So there was too much underground economy happening where taxes weren't being generated to the proper governments. Like, you're not filling storefronts, you're not filling jobs. Unless you're in the boat business or the motor, the boat engine business, it wasn't really good for the economy. That was the interesting thing when Prohibition first came in. The amount of motorboat licenses, applications went through the roof.
Did they really?
Absolutely, through the roof, because people were just like, I'm going to whip this stuff across the river. So it was just one of those. And then it was like, oh, wait a second, there must be something happening here. And they started to pull back on it. But again, people find a way, right? They find the weak spot and they find the way. So, right. But it was bringing Prohibition back in. People are back out. They're out in public. They're not hiding. They're walking the streets, they're visiting stores, and not just saloons, but just generally in public. And then the economy sort of normalized again. And then again, trudging back to what we're talking about with COVID, we're still seeing that dust settling from COVID in terms of people coming back out again, visiting their stores, and that kind of thing. So there's definitely history repeating itself for different reasons, but that pause in your life.
Yeah, it comes to an end. Yeah. Paul Meek from Kichesippi, have we forgotten anything? Is there any part of Prohibition that we need to revisit?
I think the big thing was that just it was a really obviously we talk about Prohibition as itself being the cancellation of alcohol, but the fact the tie into history with the First World War and the massive impact that women had in society at the time, being empowering themselves and being voters and being a major contributor, and it was a huge part of the women's movement. And we talk about Prohibition as being this horrible thing, but there was definitely good things to come of it, and probably the biggest one was in terms of women being empowered in society and being a voice that was respected and had the power to make change. And I think that's a part of the prohibition that's definitely forgotten about these days.
Excellent. Well, that's a great way to end it, a great final thought. Paul Meek from Kichesippi, thank you. I'm David Schellenberg. You've been watching Hoppy History.